Shabbat Shalom. I hope those of you who enjoyed niguning and nourishing, that you feel nourished and niguned. We heard you at the beginning because the microphone was on in the lobby, so it was like we also got to be nourished by the nigunim. So this is Shabbat Zachor, as I mentioned, if you were in here for Torah service. It's a specific Shabbat that we have right before Purim every year, not specific to this year. Every year, Shabbat Zachor falls right before Purim. And I'm curious to hear from all of you what you think the Zachor is. If you know what it is, don't give it away. But what is the Zachor for? What are we trying to remember? What is the memory about right before Purim? Okay, if it seems like maybe everybody knows. Okay, so someone who does know, tell us what we're remembering. Yeah, Deb.
I'm under the impression that we're remembering Amalek.
Great.
Haman is also identified with Amalek.
Fabulous. So that's the connection to Purim, right? That we are remembering Amalek because we believe that Haman might be a descendant of Amalek. And what are we remembering about Amalek? Fabulous. And what's the action item around remembering Amalek?
Genocide.
That's okay. That's not what we're supposed to do, but what is what's the okay? But what's the framing around what we're remembering to then do? Yeah.
We're remembering to not forget.
Great.
Blot out the memory of Amalek, whatever remembering and not forgetting is at the same time.
Great. Okay. Fabulous. It's like you wrote my source sheet. Okay. So we are remembering to not forget what Amalek did. And Michael's kind of right that the idea here is to blot out, to get rid of anyone who may be associated with Amalek because of what Sima said, what they did to us, that we were supposed to then come out of wanting to destroy them, right? It was a surprise attack, one that we were not expecting, hence surprise, but that we didn't expect for it to be such a big catastrophe, and therefore we're supposed to get rid of this enemy. Okay, and then as Deborah said, the connection to Purim is that we believe that Haman is a descendant from Amalek. Okay, so that's just setting the scene for what Shabbat Zachor is. Now think just in Judaism in general, where are other moments of Zachor? What are other moments of memory? Great. Shabbat. Right? That we are supposed to remember Shabbat and keep it holy. Scott? Okay. So, great. So, a day of remembrance, right? I thought you were talking about Yom HaZikaron in terms of the more modern day holiday that we're going to have in just a few months, right? Around those who have passed fighting for and living in Israel. The idea of Rosh Hashanah of Yom Kippur having a day of Yizkor, right? It's all coming from the same root, right? Not a day, but a moment of remembrance, a ceremony around Yizkor of being able to Zachor, to remember those who have come in our lifetime before us, who have influenced our lives. Where else? Pesach, great. That we remember the story and therefore we create this experiential dinner, right? This experiential experience, not to be redundant, around how we can remember and therefore enact in some ways what it is that we are remembering. What else do we remember in Judaism?
We ask God to remember us.
Okay, great. So there are moments in our liturgy where we're requesting that God think of us in God's memory, right? In God's acknowledgement that there is memory there. What else? Yeah.
I think there's something about the Greeks remembering.
The covenant. Yes. Yeah. So the idea that we should remember our covenant with God, right? Or covenant as a people. What I'm trying to point out here is that Judaism is a religion based on memory. right? That we are if you have not read the book Zachor, you should. It's a really fabulous book. I had to read it for school, but it's fabulous. Really, really wonderful, and points out all the ways in which we are a religion, we are a tradition that not only is built upon, but also craves memory. And what we tend to do with it in Judaism is create ritual around, if we're supposed to remember something, what we can then do to acknowledge it in our lives, to remember it, right? So that we don't forget it. But in the case of Amalek, we're actually supposed to remember something that was bad for us, or bad to us, and then do away with it. So as Deb said earlier, there's this very bizarre language that we're going to see in just one moment about remembering and not forgetting, but also then doing something to make sure that we no longer acknowledge or have this enemy in our midst, in our existence. Everybody with me so far? Okay, I'm going to pass out these sheets now. Now I am ready for that. Gavi, you want to help Jacob pass these out? You can just both take different sides of the room. Okay, so this is the passage of Torah that Daphna just read. This was our maftir. So I'm not going to read it in the Hebrew because you just heard it, but I want to point out the bolded words here. Zachor, right, remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. Okay, we're not going to go into like the historical where and when and who. That's not as important for today. You heard a little bit of that in people's summary. But the first word of this passage, which, spoiler, this is why we read it on Shabbat Zachor, is because it starts with the word Zachor, remember. Right? This is the quintessential moment here is memory. We need to remember. Zachor asher asa lecha Amalek. We need to remember what Amalek did to us. Now, is this a painful memory or a good memory? It's a painful memory, right? Just like when we think about or when we have a day like Yom HaZikaron or we have a day like Yom HaShoah, right? We are putting ourselves into a situation in which the memory is not a good, happy, celebratory one. It's one that we must have to be able to move ourselves forward in an existence so that we learn from our history. We learn from our past. And as I mentioned to Rabbi Klickfeld when we were in senior staff earlier this week, when I was looking through sources about this, the thing that this made me think the most about was October 7th. That there's so much in this passage, right, about remembering what happened and acknowledging memory, even though for some of us we might not think of it as memory yet, right? It's still very much a reality in our bodies every day. But to be able to remember something so that we learn from it, right? We all have this in our lives. There's some memory that you have in your life, probably a few, not just one, where something happened and now you act differently based off of a memory because it was either bad or it was really great. And so you want to make sure either not to do it or to do it again. Or to do it differently. Thank you. So then the passage goes on. Again, this is exactly what Daphna just read. The passage goes on, but the end of the last sentence of verse 19 says, "You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget." What's interesting about that phrase? You shall blot out the memory of Amalek and do not forget.
It's a paradox.
Okay, say more.
Because it's saying to blot out the memory, but then don't forget also. If you blot out the memory, you should forget.
Right. So if you're going to blot out the memory, then you should forget. You should put it aside. But then it's saying don't forget. So are we supposed to, as Michael said at the beginning, is this saying get rid of the humans, not the memory? Or is it saying to make sure that you are getting rid of the power of that memory, but still learning from it? Yeah, Nika.
Could it be, just looking at the words, is that Zecher?
Yeah.
Like if we were to repoint it, it could be a Zachal, which I feel like, I wonder if it's like a little bit more, could be a little bit more intense, like actually blot out all the males of
That's interesting.
Amalek,
Mm-hmm.
which is like a little bit darker, but.
Yeah. You and Michael can have coffee after. Yeah, so Nico pointed out that if we punctuated this root differently, it could be that we are specifically saying to get rid of the men of Amalek who did this to us, right? To make sure that they are no longer walking the earth. Yeah, Deborah, sorry, and then Jacob.
Amalek is persistent about resurfacing, so just when you think you've got it gone, don't forget, it could come back.
Great. So maybe it's this thing that keeps coming back, and we need to remember it so that we can recognize it to then make sure that we are not victim to this idea or this people or this behavior of Amalek again. Jacob?
It could be that it's a charge for us. It's a charge for us as a people moving about in the rest of the world. That when others see that that they can take advantage of other people at their lowest points, that we can take advantage of the weak, that becomes a contagious thought. And so people around the world say, well, this guy's taking advantage of the weak. I mean, to get ahead, I have to do the same. I can do the same, so I will. And so perhaps the Timchet Zecher Amalek is the charge for us to out in the world to make it so that this idea of taking advantage of the weak cannot persist in the world, and that we should not forget Lo Tishkach, that we should not forget what happened to us, so that out in the world we make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else.
Great. So it's a learning opportunity, right? Taken from something that was very terrible for us as a people, but to also make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else, that it doesn't become something where people can see tactic around power taking over the weak, right? As we're going to see in a second, they came from the back, which was in terms of like army formation, right? That's the weakest point. So is it possible, Jacob's using it in a more modern sense, not in necessarily a war sense, but if people who are weaker are then being taken advantage of, is it our responsibility to understand what this really idea of Amalek, rather than just the forceful, violent nature of it, could be, and therefore could affect other people, and to really do away with that, do away with the harm that can be done to people based off of the, let's call it ideology that led Amalek to do what they did.
I'm struck by the fact that this says that Amalek attacked undeterred by the fear of God. Now,
Right.
God is all powerful.
Right.
In this particular historical context, and he can split the Red Sea and take the people out of Egypt, but he can't keep the Amaleks from attacking the rear guard of the Israelites. And then it says, blot out the memory of Amalek from heaven, from under heaven. And I think there's something about that this happened on God's watch. Okay, this is a memory that uses the term under heaven. So
Interesting.
I'm not sure that this is not something that this means that you should forget it. It may go so far as to say that you have to guard your rear, when you're
Right.
traveling or whatever the lessons are. But it's significant that God didn't stop this, and it's significant that they say that this is the fear that you should blot out from under heaven.
Interesting. So using that God language in both ways. Okay, 1, 2, then we're gonna move 3, and then we're gonna move on. Okay, we're gonna move on.
Sometimes we mention the name of a terrible enemy.
Yeah.
Yimach Shemo,
Right.
which to wipe out. I always
Yes.
took that to mean, I don't know if I understand it correctly, they won't have more generations. Their names will disappear. So they will, be cast off into history. But
Yeah.
with Zachor, there will be others.
Yeah.
Like them, but not them.
Great. So Marcus pointed out something that I didn't actually add to the source sheet, but I read a lot about, that there's this I'll call it a custom that if you say an enemy's name, that you should also follow it with Yimach Shemo, that we are going to erase that name, right? And yet for Amalek, we use the word Zachor, in which case we recognize that this is going to happen again, or there are going to be more incidents like this, which is both a scary but a very perceptive thought, because if we just do away with the memory of it, then we might not be prepared for if this were to happen again. If we just, erase that idea or that name, right? It's as if they're not going to exist. But instead, with Amalek, we see it as something that definitely will come up again in the future. And so we need to learn from it and be prepared for it and do better to make sure that it does not happen. Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, along that point, this says to me it's about safety.
Yeah.
Say, when you're safe, you're not safe.
Yeah.
So don't forget.
Right.
On October 7th, we forgot.
Right. So this idea of we might think we're safe, but we're not actually safe because, again, to get actually back to this point, right, there's always going to be a case of Amalek somewhere. And so we need to be prepared that might be even lurking behind, even when we feel like we're at our safest moment. Yeah. Harrison?
We're asking about the contradiction between flat out his name, but don't forget.
Yeah.
It doesn't say forget and don't forget.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking it's focusing on the action
Right.
as opposed to the result.
Right.
And so it goes along with what a lot of people are saying, which is it's something you're working toward. You're
Yeah.
working toward protecting people. You're working toward trying to eradicate evil from the world.
Yeah.
It's what we're doing in order to make it better and learn from the
Right.
mistake, and then also not forgetting the horrible, horrific things that happen.
Right. Exactly. And I think, yeah, Nika. I can see you're just like jumping out of your seat.
Looking at the word mitaka here,
Yeah.
and like this word appears like mitaka when we're talking about like the people being around Har Sinai, which makes me think like
Yeah,
like,
great.
If we're talking about like Amalek mitaka like Shemayim, like it makes me think of like the enemies at the gate, right? They're like, threatening to storm the castle, like remove them, or like when we talk about someone one king or queen succeeding another, we use the same word taka, right? So and so ruled taka, so and so. So it almost feels like the text could also be saying, or another read could be like, remove this usurper, like remove this usurper who has like taken over the world and like subverted like the values of Shemayim. And don't forget that you continue to do that.
Michal Bitton said something very similar to what you're getting at. I wasn't super interested in this becoming like an October 7th comparison, so I didn't bring it as a source. But she spoke. I'm forgetting with who. She did an interview earlier this week. Did anybody else see it? Okay. I was just curious if you could remember who the interview was with. Anyway, she was saying that when we think about coming to the table with our enemies, often they're not enemies that are trying to let me say this differently. Often if we're coming to the table with someone who is different than us, who we have conflict with, I won't use the word enemy yet, it is because we are able to see similar values. We are able to see that this is a person who still wants good in the world. It might be in a different path than I do, but still wants good in the world, still wants, as in her words, put food on the table for their children, have a good life, etc., etc. And she said, but with Amalek, and she was making the comparison to Hamas, she said that there's no value comparison, right? There's no way of that coming to the table because the values are going in separate directions. So this idea of seeing ourselves as a people able to acknowledge that we do have enemies, and that's hard to do in our day. Rabbi Kligfeld, one of his first sermons after October 7th, talked about how we do have enemies. Like, we need to just acknowledge that and be aware of it. And yeah, it's scary, but it is also true. And that this is Torah telling us, similar to what we were talking about in terms of getting rid of the name or remembering the name, that we need to remind ourselves once and again, like, it might be scary, but it's also reality. So we have to continue with that. I don't know that we're going to get to the rest of these sources, but Rabbi Kligfeld and then Gabi.
I want to agree with Harris and build on it that I don't think.
Here, you can just use this, so I don't have to repeat.
I want to agree with Harris and say I don't know that there is necessarily a paradox in Zachor Lo Tishkach. It might be redundant, but to remember does indeed mean not to forget. And I think that the phrase in between Timched Zecher Amalek, I sense that Michael was saying it sort of half seriously, half punchingly before. I don't think this is an invitation to genocide at all. I think it's to, particularly because the setup of the verse is that once the Jewish people are already safe in their land, and there's no more fear from enemies, that's when the obligation comes in to Timched Zecher Amalek, not to wipe out a nation, because at that point you're already actually safe from the enemies, but to wipe out Amalekism, and to wipe out Amalekism from your own soul, your own people, and to wipe out Amalekism as it comes up. That to me is not an invitation, although there's plenty of verses in the Torah, particularly as the Israelites are heading into the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua, that can be compared to the notion of wiping out a nation. I don't think this is it whatsoever. I think this is once you're safe, that is the easiest time for the Amalek forces in the world from within you and beyond you to wake, and that's when blotting out Amalekism is most obligatory for the Jewish people. And I think that's the same today. I think that we do have an obligation to blot out Amalekism wherever it pops up, both when applied towards us and applied towards others.
Got it.
This is my first time really hearing about online.
Yeah.
So I think you might have answered my question.
Okay.
But I was really going to ask, but now I'm just curious.
Yeah.
What was the purpose of the attack?
It's a really, really good question. The purpose of the attack was that there was a what's the word I'm looking for? Not advantage, an opportunity, right, for these people to attack. And just like what was happening all over the Torah, when an enemy saw that there was possibility to attack for power, for land, for people, right, to get something that they wanted, that was how they did it. So there was an attack against these people through force, and also, and what you'll see here in this third bullet point, right, they really made sure that it was something that hit the heartstrings also, right, which is different than like all other army moments in the Torah where there were like two armies going against one another and people died. But in this moment, Amalek came from the back of the people, which is where people who were walking slower were, people who might have had disabilities were, people who, what else do they say? Right, the elderly, probably children also, anybody who wasn't able to stay with the pack, right? So they were hitting us hardest in terms of our heart, but also in terms of who they were going to get. Yeah, Michael.
My comment was in no way related to anything that happened post-biblical history, but I also I don't want to be disingenuous, right? Like for virtually all of the history of interpreting the Torah as I've ever been taught it, right? Those psukim do mean killing everyone from Amalek, and the commentary on the page says that is blot out their name, wipe them out. And the Haftarah we read today, Shaul loses his kingdom specifically because he spares one king and a bunch of animals. I'm okay that we're uncomfortable with the idea that we're commanded to commit genocide, and I'm okay with the idea that we want to reframe that, but to pretend or to not acknowledge the mainstream interpretation of that verse as it's essentially always been read. I just want to point out that is what the Torah seems to mean, and that is the thread that's carried through, and that is why in Megillah Esther, when the Mordechai-led forces fight and kill everyone, right, they are correcting the mistake from Shaul's war, because it says they kill everyone, but don't take the spoil, which was part of what Shaul did that cost him his kingdom. Like that's what it meant.
So I think, and I think that what we're going to get to, if I can, for the next 2 minutes, I'm going to pick maybe one of the sources that I put on here, maybe two, but that it seems like I don't want to say like you're right and you're right and you're right, but I think that at different times in history, this, to your point, meant different things, right? Like it could have meant do away with the people. It could have meant do away with the kind of mentality of. It could have do away with like the hint of, right? The opportunity of, if you see it coming out of someone, something, doing away with it. So I think you're right. I think people are uncomfortable with hearing the word genocide. And I also think, and this is where like the rabbi in me is, you're right and you're also right, that there is something to be said for if we're supposed to blot it out, but we're also supposed to remember it, right? There has to be some partnering or sharing of it being both individuals or just humans, and also it being a general mentality or way of behaving, because that gets passed down also, right? Then Schatz doesn't just get passed down, but hopefully the values that I hold and whatnot get passed down from my parents to me to future children. So I think, again, I think you're right. I think everyone's right. So far, that could change. Just kidding. So we're gonna do one source on here, but I'm glad that this struck a chord for people. So I want to add one rabbinic source in here. Okay. So look at page 2. For those of you who come to Beit Hanu all the time, you should recognize that I put page numbers. I never do that, so this is a big deal for me. In Likutei Halachot, it says here that the core idea in the service of God is that a person should have no fear. As our rabbis taught us, shebe'olam hazeh ha'adam sarich la'avor al gesher tsar me'od, ve'ha'ikar hu shelo yitpached adam klal. For those of you who know Hebrew grammar really well, what is that saying that the song that we sing at camp does not say? V'ha'ikar hu shelo yitpached ha'adam klal. Yes, Sima.
Like, should be cause to feel fear.
Yes, exactly. Right. So the song that you probably have heard or you don't remember hearing, but is Kol halam kula gesher tzar mehod, gesher tzar mehod, gesher Kol halam kula gesher tzar mehod, gesher tzar mehod V'ha'ikar lo lefached. That's very different than lo yitpached, right? That there is a change here, that it's not just that you should assume that everything, that the essence of living or the essence of being is not to be afraid. It's not to cause yourself to be afraid. That's what's coming out in this particular source here. And that goes along, I think, with more the mentality of Amalek, right? That we need to actually remind ourselves, which might bring back bad memories, but so that we are not fearing ourselves, basically, by being in the world where we do have enemies and where anything could happen. And if we walk down the street in a kippah, even in Los Angeles, we don't necessarily know in 2024 what that could mean, right? But if you walk around the world like that, scaring yourself, which is what this is saying, that's no way to live. And last 2 weeks ago, I was at Ruach Nashim and we talked about this source at one point. And one of the things I thought was so beautiful that someone brought up was that a bridge, hopefully, even though it's very narrow, has other people on it. And also needs to be weighted proportionally so that it doesn't fall. And so if we're in a world in which other people around us, and we can just assume that by remembering something that was bad for our people, or I'll just include others who have also been persecuted, that we can do a little part on that bridge to make sure that people aren't living in a constant state of fear, that they are not scaring themselves through living life. It goes on to say, blah, 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 the most important thing as a person is strengthening herself to walk across this narrow bridge in peace and without fear is faith. So I I don't know that they mean faith like you should daven 3 times a day or keep Shabbat. I'm not sure that that's really what they mean by faith, but that you should have, it says here, ha'emunah ha'kedosha, right? That you should have some kind of understanding of holy connection, of holy understanding. Who was saying emunah earlier, right? This idea of amen, that when we say amen to other people in a room, we're saying, yeah, I believe you, I'm with you, I'm standing with you on that bridge. And so even when we have to remember hard things, if we do it in community, if we do it with other people, hopefully then we're also able to do away with that which is potentially going to make us scared. I'm going to read this last piece by Rabbi Lizzie Heidemann. I'm going to let her words be the last ones. She wrote this a few years ago, but I think it still rings true today. Purim shares a name with Yom Kippur, Yom HaKippurim, which is weird because Yom Kippur is opposite on the calendar and in practice, right? If you look at a calendar, Yom Kippur and Purim are on opposite sides of a calendar. But ultimately, both holidays are about reckoning with the fact that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The world can turn upside down in an instant. You wake up one morning and the world is a different place. On Yom Kippur, the answer is life is short and we don't know what tomorrow brings, so fast, forgive, and apologize. On Purim, the answer is life is short and we don't know what tomorrow brings, so eat and drink and be merry. The genius of the Jewish calendar is that these extremes on either pole show us how to live the rest of the year navigating that gray. The rabbis of the Talmud say that one day when Mashiach comes, when we've all done our homework and so totally transformed the world that Amalek has been erased from the planet, Purim will be the only holiday we still celebrate. And why Purim? I think one reason might be that this holiday encapsulates the whole Jewish tradition. The story and mitzvot of Purim are a rubric for an integrated Jewish identity, one that holds onto the past but isn't defined by it. That is our people's alchemy, taking the pain of our story and turning it into a blessing for the whole world. Shabbat Shalom.